I used to believe nothing could surprise me anymore, not after 72 years of watching the world shift under my feet, losing my husband, raising children through lean times, burying friends one by one. I thought I had already endured the worst. I was wrong. My name is Evelyn Walker. I've lived in the same little blue house in Columbus, Ohio, for 47 years. David and I bought it when our youngest, Kathy, was just a baby. We built a life inside these walls. Christmas mornings with wrapping paper everywhere, birthday cakes balanced on tired hands, quiet evenings spent listening to the old radio while the kids bickered in the next room. After David died, this house was the only thing that still felt steady, a place that belonged to me when everything else seemed to belong to everyone else. I never imagined it could be taken from me. It was late April when the heart attack came. I was out in the garden, coaxing a stubborn row of peonies to bloom. I bent over to pull a weed, and a sharp pain clamped down on my chest so fast I couldn't breathe. The trowel dropped from my hand. My knees hit the dirt. I don't remember much after that. Just the gravel biting my palms as I tried to crawl to the porch and the distant sound of my neighbor shouting my name. When I woke up, the first thing I saw was a fluorescent ceiling tile in the hospital ICU. My mouth was so dry I could barely speak. A nurse leaned over me with a gentle smile. "You're okay," she said softly. "You had a heart attack, but you're stable now." The words didn't feel real. I tried to sit up, and a wave of weakness rolled through me so strong I thought I'd pass out again. I remember thinking, thank God the kids will help. And for a little while it seemed they would. Kathy was the first to arrive. She swept into the room in a swirl of expensive perfume and brisk reassurance, smoothing my hair off my forehead and clucking her tongue at the beeping machines. "Mom," she sighed, "you have to start letting us help you more. You can't keep doing everything alone." I was too tired to argue. David, my son, showed up the next morning with a grocery bag of things from home. A robe, my reading glasses, a framed photo of David and me on our wedding day. He propped it on the bedside table like a promise. "You'll be back here soon." I wanted to believe him. But every time I closed my eyes, I felt the cold edge of fear. I wasn't afraid of dying, not really. I was afraid of what would happen to everything I'd built if I wasn't around to protect it. One afternoon, Kathy showed up with a stack of mail and a clipboard. She told me she'd been sorting things out, so I wouldn't have to worry. "Don't fuss, Mum," she said when I tried to sit up to look. "Just rest. I'll take care of the house. I had the locks changed so I could let in the cleaning service." I blinked at her. "You changed the locks?" "It's safer this way," she insisted, her voice breezy, but her eyes didn't quite meet mine. I was too weak to argue, but something in my chest, some part of me that had survived 72 years of hard lessons, began to stir uneasily. That night, a nurse came in to check my vitals. She paused by the monitor, frowning, then turned to me. "Your daughter said she's managing your bills now," she said carefully. "Is that correct?" My mouth went dry. "She said you'd signed paperwork giving her power of attorney." I swallowed hard. "I haven't signed anything." The nurse's frown deepened. "Maybe double-check with her. Hospitals are very particular about authorizations." I lay awake for hours after she left, my mind racing. Kathy had always been the practical one, efficient, organized, sometimes so blunt it bordered on cruel. But she'd never done anything like this, had she? I told myself it was probably a misunderstanding, that she was just trying to help. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something precious had slipped out of my hands when I wasn't looking. The next morning, Kathy showed up again, her smile too bright. She smoothed the blankets around my shoulders, her manicured hand lingering on my arm, just a little too long. "Don't worry about a thing," she said. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I realized I did not trust my own daughter. I turned my face to the window, so she wouldn't see the tears gathering in my eyes. I had no idea that the worst was still coming. When you've raised someone, held them as a baby, wiped their tears, It's almost impossible to believe they'd do something to hurt you. That's why I kept trying to find excuses. Maybe Kathy had misunderstood the nurse. Maybe she was just overwhelmed, trying to keep everything afloat while I lay there tethered to machines. But by the second week in the hospital, the excuses started to unravel. It was a Tuesday morning when the notary came. I remember the smell of her hand lotion, lavender too strong, and the way she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Kathy stood beside her, a thin smile stretched across her face. "Mum," she began, her voice syrupy sweet, "we need you to sign a few forms so I can keep paying the bills. You don't want to fall behind." I looked at the clipboard the notary held. The top page was labeled Durable Power of Attorney. My heart started thudding so hard, it drowned out the steady beep of the heart monitor. "Kathy," I whispered, "I never agreed to this." She sighed, flicking her eyes toward the notary as if I were an unruly child embarrassing her. "It's just paperwork. Standard stuff." The notary cleared her throat, her gaze flicking nervously between us. "I can step out if you'd like to review," she offered. "No," I said firmly. My voice was stronger than it had been in days. "I'm not signing anything." Kathy's smile didn't waver, but a muscle in her jaw twitched. "Mum, you're not well," she said quietly, leaning closer. "We're trying to help you. If you keep refusing, it makes things complicated." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. I said no. She straightened, her face going blank. "Fine," she turned to the notary. "We'll reschedule." They left the room without another word. As soon as the door clicked shut, my hands began to shake so violently I had to clutch the blanket to still them. I knew then that this wasn't just about paying bills. Later that afternoon, my son David came by. He looked tired, older than his 50 years. But when he smiled, I saw the boy he used to be. "How are you feeling, Mum?" he asked, settling into the chair by my bed. I studied his face, searching for something. Guilt, hesitation, anything that would tell me he knew what Kathy was trying to do. "David," I said softly, "did you know Kathy was trying to have me sign over power of attorney?" He shifted in his chair. "She mentioned it." "And you think that's okay?" He looked away, his hands folding and unfolding in his lap. "It's just until you're better." "But I'm not incompetent," I said. My voice broke on the last word. "Mum," he began, his voice careful, "you're 72. You had a heart attack. Kathy's just planning ahead." I closed my eyes, fighting the sudden wave of exhaustion. "Planning ahead," I repeated dully. When he left, I lay staring at the ceiling tiles until the room blurred into nothing. That night, I dreamed I was standing in my garden again, but the flowers were all gone. The earth had been scraped bare, and my house was nothing but an empty lot. The earth had been scraped bare, and my house was nothing but an empty lot. I woke up with tears drying on my cheeks. The next morning, I asked to see the hospital social worker. She was a brisk, no-nonsense woman named Marcia, with a clipboard she seemed surgically attached to. I told her everything. Kathy's insistence, the notary, the papers I hadn't signed. Marcia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set her pen down and looked me square in the eye. "Mrs. Walker, have you noticed any changes to your accounts or property?" I shook my head. "I've been here. I don't know what's happening at home." "Do you have anyone you trust who can check on things?" The question hit me like a slap, because the answer was no. David and Kathy were my only family left. The question hit me like a slap, because the answer was no. David and Kathy were my only family left. And in that moment, I realized how dangerous that was. Marcia handed me a brochure about elder financial abuse. I stared down at the bold letters, the bullet points that sounded like someone had been following me around taking notes. Unexplained changes in property documents, sudden insistence on signing legal forms, isolation from trusted contacts. I felt my throat close. "You're not alone," Marcia said gently, as if she could read my thoughts. This happens more often than you'd think. But they're my children, I whispered. She didn't look away. That doesn't always matter. I clutched the brochure to my chest after she left, my hands shaking. I knew then that I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, because if I did, I might not have a home to come back to. When they finally discharged me, the sky was a soft grey, the kind of spring day that always made me think of starting over. But there was no fresh start waiting at home, only dread. Kathy didn't offer to pick me up. I called a cab instead, clutching my overnight bag to my chest the whole ride. The driver kept glancing in the mirror like he could feel something was wrong. I tried to calm myself, to rehearse the most reasonable explanations. Maybe Kathy had only meant to tidy up. Maybe David had misunderstood. Maybe all those late-night fears were just the product of too many painkillers and too much time alone. When the cab pulled up to my driveway, my heart sank. The blinds in the living room were pulled shut. That might not have seemed strange, except I always left them half open for the cat I'd had before I fell ill, so he could look out at the yard. It was a habit, something I never forgot to do. I paid the driver and stepped carefully up the walk, each step feeling heavier than the last. The lock turned smoothly. Kathy hadn't changed it again. But when I pushed the door open, the house smelled wrong. Too clean, like someone had been here scrubbing away any trace of me. I walked into the kitchen. My papers were stacked in a neat pile on the table, too neat. My bills, insurance statements, and bank envelopes, all carefully arranged. A note in Kathy's handwriting sat on top. Mom organized your files so you wouldn't have to worry. Call if you have questions. My throat went dry. I moved to the hall closet, where I kept my locked filing cabinet, where I stored my deed, will, and all the documents that proved this house was mine. The little brass lock glinted in the dim light. I bent down, squinting. There were fresh scratches on the metal, tiny grooves where someone had tried to pry it open. I felt my stomach twist. My hands went numb. Fumbling with my keys, I unlocked the cabinet and yanked the drawer open. The folder with my property deed was gone. I stood there, staring into the empty space where my most important papers had been, and my ears filled with a high, tinny ringing. I had never felt so vulnerable. When David and Kathy were children, I'd protected them from everything, from scraped knees to broken hearts. I never imagined I'd need to protect myself from them. The phone rang, jolting me. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something in me, maybe the same voice that had kept me alive through the heart attack, told me to answer. It was a man with a smooth, rehearsed voice. "Hello, Mrs. Walker. This is Greg Thomas from Century Realty, just calling to confirm we'll be showing the property tomorrow at noon." I sank into the nearest chair. "I'm sorry," I managed. "What property?" "Your house at 114 East Maple," he said cheerfully, as if we were old friends. "This is my house," I whispered. There was a pause. Then, cautiously, "Your daughter and son have the signed power of attorney on file. They assured us you'd be moved into care soon. I apologize if I've caught you at a bad time." I couldn't breathe. "No," I said slowly. "You need to cancel any showings. Immediately. Mrs. Walker, This house is not for sale," I said, my voice rising, shaking. "And I will be contacting my lawyer. Do you understand?" He stammered something. An apology. A promise to look into it. But I hung up before he could finish. I sat there, the phone still clutched in my hand, staring at the neat little stack of bills Kathy had left. They hadn't waited. While I lay in that hospital bed, fighting to stay alive, they were already planning to erase me. I pulled myself up, legs trembling, and started opening every drawer and cabinet in the house. Half my files were missing. The safety deposit box key I kept taped under the silverware drawer was gone. I pressed a hand to my mouth to hold back a sob. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was theft. I tried to tell myself I shouldn't be surprised. Kathy had always been ambitious. David always easily led. But there's something different about knowing, really knowing, The people you love are willing to steal everything you built. I forced myself to take one deep, steadying breath. I would not let them win. I didn't care how old I was or how frail they thought me. I was still their mother, and I was still the woman who had survived losing her husband, raising 2 children alone, and a heart attack that should have killed me. They'd forgotten what I was capable of, but they were about to remember. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the sky still dark outside my bedroom window. For a long time, I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to gather the strength to do what came next. I've never thought of myself as particularly brave. I'm not loud, not the kind of woman who likes to make trouble. But that day, I knew I had to, because if I didn't stand up for myself, no one else would. After a cup of coffee that tasted like ashes, I pulled out the list the hospital social worker had given me, names of attorneys who specialized in elder law. I started calling down the list. The first one, a man with a brisk voice, interrupted me before I'd even finished explaining. These cases are complicated, Mrs. Walker. If you signed any paperwork, even under medication, it can be hard to prove undue influence. I didn't sign anything, I said. Can you prove that? His tone was so flat, so dismissive, that I hung up without saying goodbye. The second law office never called back. The third receptionist promised someone would return my call. Hours passed with nothing. I was about to give up for the day when the phone finally rang. Mrs. Walker, a warm, confident voice said. This is Angela Ruiz. You called about a possible power of attorney fraud? Yes, I breathed. Thank you for calling me back. She asked me to explain everything, and for the first time, I told the story without stumbling or apologizing for how it sounded. I laid it out. Kathy's sudden need for signatures, the notary, the missing deed, the real estate agent. When I finally finished, there was a pause on the line. You did the right thing calling me, she said firmly. Do you have any documents you can bring in? Yes, I whispered. I saved everything I could. Good. I want you to come see me first thing tomorrow. Bring everything. When I hung up, my hands were shaking so badly I had to set the phone down. But for the first time since I'd come home, I didn't feel completely alone. The next morning, I dressed carefully. Fresh slacks, a pressed blouse, the string of pearls David had given me years before, back when I still believed he'd always protect me. I wanted to look like someone worth taking seriously. Angela's office was in a small brick building tucked between a pharmacy and a flower shop. She met me in the waiting area herself, a woman maybe in her 40s, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. Come on back, she said, leading me into a cozy office with a window overlooking a little courtyard. I laid my papers out on her desk. Kathy's note, the bills, the realtor's letter. Angela studied them in silence, her brow furrowing. When she looked up, her eyes were clear and steady. Mrs. Walker, everything you've told me is consistent with financial exploitation, she said calmly, and you're right to be concerned. If you hadn't come home when you did, this house could have been sold. A cold wave of nausea rolled through me. What can I do? I whispered. First, we file for an injunction to freeze any sale. That will stop them from completing any transactions, she explained. Then we'll notify the title company that you dispute the validity of the power of attorney. If they attempt to proceed, they'll be liable too. I nodded slowly, trying to absorb her words. And the deed? We'll subpoena any documents they filed and have a handwriting expert verify your signature, she continued. If it's forged, that's criminal fraud. My hands twisted together in my lap. They're my children, I said softly. I don't want them to go to jail. Angela's expression gentled. I understand. But you have to protect yourself. You almost lost your home, Mrs. Walker. You have every right to take this seriously. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I was back in the hospital bed. Kathy standing over me with her too bright smile. I don't want to be afraid anymore, I said, my voice breaking. Angela leaned forward, her voice low and steady. Then let's make sure you never have to be again. We spent the next hour going over every detail, dates, names, anything that might help build my case. By the time I left her office, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, hope. When I got home, the house still felt strange, too quiet, too heavy with all that had been taken. But I sat at the kitchen table and made a list of everything I needed to do next. Change the locks, call the bank, find out if any accounts had been opened in my name. I was tired, bone tired, but I wasn't ready to give up, because no matter how much they'd tried to erase me, I was still here, and I was going to fight. A week later, Angela called to tell me she'd received copies of the documents Kathy and David had filed. She said she'd prefer I come to her office to review them in person. I knew what that meant. The signatures were forged. I spent the night before our meeting sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the old photograph of my children as toddlers. Kathy with her gap-toothed smile, David clutching the stuffed bear he wouldn't go to sleep without. I wondered when they'd decided I was worth more as an obstacle than as a mother. By morning, I was done wondering. Angela greeted me with a firm nod. She had already set out the papers on the table in her conference room. "Are you ready?" she asked gently. I took a breath. Yes. She turned the first page toward me. I knew the moment I saw it that it wasn't my handwriting. My name was there, but the swoop in the W was wrong. The line of the signature was too straight, as if someone had practiced it over and over. "They didn't even get it close," I whispered. Angela tapped the notary's stamp. "We've already subpoenaed the notary's logbook. If the stamp was used fraudulently, that's an additional felony." My hands trembled as I flipped to the next document, a power of attorney transferring management of all my assets to Kathy and David. I felt something crack open in my chest, some last small belief that this had been a misunderstanding. "This was intentional," I said. Angela nodded solemnly. "I'm afraid so." She let me sit with that a moment before she spoke again. "I think it's time we invite them in. It's better they hear it directly. I can be present as your counsel. If they try to pressure you, I'll intervene." I swallowed. My throat felt tight. "They'll deny it," I said softly. "They might," she agreed, "but the evidence is on your side." That afternoon, Kathy and David arrived together. I watched them walk across the parking lot through Angela's window. Kathy in her crisp blazer, David looking down at the ground, shoulders hunched. Angela led them into the conference room. Kathy barely glanced at me. David wouldn't look at all. Angela folded her hands neatly on the table. "Thank you both for coming. Mrs. Walker has retained me as her attorney. I'm sure you understand why." Kathy let out a sharp little laugh. "Because she's confused," she said, flicking her eyes to me with practiced pity. "Mum, you're not thinking clearly. You've been sick." "I'm thinking clearer than I have in years," I interrupted, my voice low. Kathy's mouth snapped shut. David shifted in his seat, finally daring to look up. "We were just trying to make sure things were in order," he said quietly. "You could have another heart attack any day." "And you thought forging my signature was the way to do that?" I demanded. Neither of them answered. Angela slid the documents across the table, one by one. "We have obtained handwriting analysis indicating these signatures do not match Mrs. Walker's known legal documents," she said calmly. "We also have the notary's log, which does not include any record of these filings." Kathy's face went pale. David swallowed hard. "It's not what you think." "No?" I said, my voice trembling. "You tried to sell my home while I was fighting for my life. You took my deed. You took my trust. And you thought I'd never find out." Kathy pressed her lips together, her eyes glinting. "You're old, Mother. You don't understand how complicated these things are." I stared at her for a long moment, my heart hammering in my chest. Then I leaned forward. "I understand perfectly," I said. "I understand you thought I was too weak to fight back." David reached for her arm, as if to hush her, but Kathy yanked it away. "Do you really think you can stop this?" she demanded. "Do you think anyone will believe you over us?" Angela's voice cut through the air like a blade. Mrs. Walker has already filed for injunctive relief and reported these actions to the authorities. Any further attempts to control her property will be considered harassment and fraud. Kathy's mouth opened, but no words came out. David looked at me then, his eyes full of something I couldn't read, regret or shame, or just the dull realization that they'd been caught. Angela stood. This meeting is over. They didn't argue. They just stood and walked out, the door shutting behind them with a soft click that seemed to echo through to the room. I sat back in my chair, shaking. Angela reached over and laid a hand on mine. You did exactly what you needed to do. I don't feel brave, I whispered. You are, she said simply. And for the first time, I let myself believe it. After that day in Angela's office, the house felt different. Not safer exactly, just mine again. There were still moments when I'd wake in the middle of the night, heart hammering, convinced I'd hear Kathy's voice on the porch, demanding to be let in. But when I opened my eyes, there was only quiet. Angela filed the injunction to freeze any pending sale within 24 hours of our meeting. The realtor called the next day to confirm the listing was cancelled. He sounded mortified, falling over himself with apologies. I thanked him because it was easier than telling him what I really felt, like someone who'd come home from war to find their house still standing, but charred around the edges. I changed the locks. I called the bank and removed both my children as authorized contacts. I signed up for alerts on every account, every utility, every insurance policy. By the end of that week, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with my age. But it was a clean exhaustion, the kind you feel when you've finally stopped running. One afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table, sorting the last of my documents into neat labeled folders. The deed, my deed, was tucked safely into the strongest lockbox I could find. I ran my hand over it, feeling the embossed county seal under my fingertips. I thought of David, sitting across from me, unable to meet my eyes. Of Kathy, her voice cold as she told me I was too old to understand. For so long, I'd believed them when they told me I was fragile, that my fear was just confusion, that my anger was irrational. But fear can be the thing that saves you, and anger, the quiet, steady kind, is sometimes the only thing that keeps you standing. When Angela called to say the county had formally recorded my affidavit disputing the fraudulent power of attorney, I felt a weight slide off my chest. It's official, she said. They can't touch your property again. I closed my eyes. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe. I wish I could tell you that was the end, that Kathy and David called to apologize, that we all found a way to make peace. But life doesn't always work like that. When the sheriff's department contacted them about the pending fraud investigation, neither of them reached out. There was no tearful confession, no remorse, just a cold, echoing silence that settled into the space where my family used to be. I grieved that silence. Some days, I still do. But I didn't regret standing up for myself. A few weeks later, I sat down with Angela to finalize my new will. I removed Kathy and David as beneficiaries and placed everything in a trust for my grandchildren, who were still too young to understand any of this. They're innocent, I told Angela quietly as I signed the papers. They shouldn't pay for their parents' choices. She nodded. It's your decision. No one can take that from you. I thought about all the nights I'd sat up worrying about whether I'd outlive my savings, whether I'd be a burden, whether my children would resent me. And I realized I'd spent too many years afraid of things that hadn't even happened yet, while the real danger was already sitting at my table, smiling politely. When I got home that afternoon, I made myself a cup of tea and walked out to the back porch. The garden was starting to bloom again. Peonies, tulips, daffodils. The weeds were back too, stubborn and persistent. I thought of that day I collapsed among those flowers, certain I wouldn't live to see another spring. But here I was. I took a slow breath and let it out. I didn't know if Kathy or David would ever face real consequences for what they'd done. Maybe the district attorney would press charges, maybe not. But I did know this: they would never again have power over me. That night, as the sun slid behind the trees and the sky turned the color of old denim, I finally allowed myself to feel proud. Proud that I'd fought. Proud that I'd survived. Proud that I'd taken everything back they thought they could steal. I was alone, but I was whole, and that was enough.